Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know the places and times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1856, at the dusty outpost of Fort Yuma on the Colorado River, a peculiar procession arrived at the gates. Leading the group was a Mohave warrior named Irataba, who had journeyed through the harsh desert landscape with a singular purpose: to return a young woman to the world she had once known. The woman who walked behind him, her face marked with 5 distinct blue lines tattooed vertically across her chin, was immediately the subject of hushed whispers. The soldiers who first spotted her reported an unsettling quality about her appearance. Not merely the tribal markings on her face, but something in her eyes that seemed both present and absent simultaneously. This woman was Olive Oatman, 19 years old, who had vanished from the American frontier 5 years earlier when her family's wagon train was attacked. The official record states that she was the sole survivor, captured and later traded to the Mohave tribe, with whom she had lived as a member until this arranged return. What happened during those 5 years in the wilderness would become the subject of endless speculation, distortion, and a silence so profound it would echo through generations. The commanding officer at Fort Yuma, Major Heinzelman, wrote in his official report, "The young woman appears physically unharmed, but demonstrates peculiar behaviors inconsistent with her upbringing. She speaks English with difficulty, as if the language has become foreign to her." What the major omitted from his official correspondence, but confided to his personal journal, was far more troubling. She watches the shadows at dusk with unusual vigilance. When asked direct questions about her time with the savages, she responds with stories that cannot possibly be true. Fort Yuma, in 1856, stood as a remote sentinel of American expansion, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures perched on a hill overlooking the confluence of the Gila and Colorado rivers. The landscape surrounding it was stark, expanses of sand and rock interrupted by sparse vegetation, a terrain so harsh that local tribes called the area the land where the sun melts the rocks. For the soldiers stationed there, this posting represented the edge of the known world, a boundary between civilization and what they perceived as wilderness. The fort's walls, which never rose higher than 10 feet, were more psychological barrier than physical defense, a demarcation between order and chaos, between the familiar and the unknown. Into this isolated outpost came Olive Oatman, crossing a threshold that was both physical and symbolic. The soldiers who witnessed her arrival described her walking with a peculiar gait, not the shuffling step of a prisoner, but something deliberate and measured, as if she were navigating by landmarks invisible to others. Sergeant William Davies, who was on duty at the gate that day, noted in a letter to his sister, "The Indian woman with blue marks on her face walked like someone following music only she could hear. The soldiers fell silent as she passed, and even the desert birds seemed to stop their calls." In the months that followed Olive's return to white society, a narrative was carefully constructed around her, a story of captivity, savage treatment, and eventual rescue. But behind closed doors, witnesses reported that Olive herself seemed reluctant to embrace this version of events. The story that follows is compiled from military records, personal correspondence, newspaper accounts, and most disturbingly, the private journals of those who encountered Olive Oatman after her return, documents that remained sealed in the Fort Yuma archives until their discovery during renovations in 1963. What you are about to hear is not merely a tale of captivity and return, but something far more unsettling, a story about what happens when a person exists between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. It is a chronicle of what was officially recorded, what was deliberately omitted, and what whispers persist even now across the wind-swept desert that separates Fort Yuma from the Mohave lands. The Oatman family had been traveling as part of a religious sectarian group, following the leadership of James Brewster, who had broken away from the Mormon Church. Their destination was a supposed land of Bashan, near the confluence of the Colorado and Gila rivers, a promised land that Brewster claimed had been revealed to him in visions. The journey had been fraught with hardship from the beginning, with families quarreling and eventually splitting into smaller groups as provisions dwindled and faith was tested. By February of 1851, the Oatman family, Royce and Mary Oatman, and their 7 children, found themselves traveling alone through the Sonoran Desert, having separated from the main party after disputes about the route. What happened next became the foundation of the Olive Oatman legend, an attack by a group identified in early accounts as Apache Indians, the murder of most of the family, and the capture of Olive and her younger sister, Mary Ann. The official account, as recorded in territorial reports and early newspaper stories, described a sudden, brutal assault on the isolated family. According to these records, a band of Indians approached the Oatmans' camp on February 18, 1851, initially appearing friendly and requesting food. After being given what little the family could spare, the Indians allegedly attacked without warning, killing Royce and Mary Oatman and 4 of their children with clubs. Olive, then 14, and her sister Mary Ann, 7, were taken captive, while their brother Lorenzo, 15, was beaten and left for dead, but later recovered. This version of events became canonical in frontier literature, fitting neatly into established narratives about Indian savagery and the dangers facing white settlers. However, Lieutenant Howard Banks, who interviewed Olive extensively upon her return, noted inconsistencies in this account. Miss Oatman's recollection of the attack contains peculiar gaps, he wrote. When pressed on certain details, she becomes distant, speaking in Mohave tongue despite understanding the questions in English. Most troubling is her insistence that they waited until Father gave the signal. When asked to explain this statement, she refuses to elaborate. Banks's private notes, found among his personal papers after his death, contain further troubling observations. When discussing the day of the attack, Miss Oatman displays none of the emotional distress one would expect from a witness to such violence. Instead, she recounts events with a detachment that borders on indifference. More concerning is her occasional slip into what appears to be an alternative version of events, references to the agreement and Father's plan, that she immediately retracts when questioned directly. The lieutenant's notes also record Olive's strange response when asked about the identity of the attackers. Miss Oatman corrected me when I referred to her captors as Apache, stating they were Yavapai, but then added, "Names mean little. They were men who understood my father's weakness." When pressed on this cryptic statement, she fell silent for several minutes before stating, "Some stories cannot be translated into your language. The words exist, but the understanding does not." What emerges from these suppressed accounts is the suggestion of a more complex narrative, one that challenged the comfortable dichotomy between innocent white victims and savage native aggressors. This alternative possibility was so disturbing to 19th century sensibilities that it was systematically excluded from official records, existing only in private doubts and questions relegated to personal correspondence and sealed documents. According to Olive's account after the attack, she and Mary Ann were forced to march for days through the desert, eventually reaching a Yavapai village, where they were treated as slaves for approximately 1 year. The fate of Mary Ann diverges in different tellings. In the public narrative, she died of starvation and mistreatment among the Yavapai, a victim of savage cruelty. In Olive's private conversations, however, a different story emerged. Sarah Palmer recorded in her journal an exchange with Olive that never appeared in published accounts. When I expressed sympathy for the loss of her sister among the savages, Miss Oatman looked at me with that unsettling directness and said, "Mary Ann did not die among the Yavapai. She lived until the second winter with the Mohave. The fever that took her came from the river, not from cruelty. When I asked why she had not corrected this detail in public accounts, she replied, "Some deaths are easier for your people to understand than others. You need Mary Ann to have died from savagery, not from the same fever that takes white children in their beds." The desert holds many secrets, and the truth about what happened to Olive Oatman during those 5 years among the Mohave may be among them. This is a journey into the spaces between official records and whispered truths, a story about the marks we bear, both visible and invisible, and how they transform us into something that others may find difficult to recognize. The settlement of Fort Yuma in 1856 existed as much as a psychological boundary as a physical one, a demarcation between what was considered civilization and wilderness. Established where the Gila River meets the Colorado, the fort represented the tentative reach of American expansion into territories still largely controlled by indigenous peoples. The soldiers stationed there lived in a constant state of vigilance, their nerves frayed by the harsh conditions and the perception of ever-present danger beyond the walls. Fort Yuma was not an impressive military installation by Eastern standards. Its buildings were primarily adobe, with some wooden structures for officers' quarters and storage. The walls, never completed to their planned height, offered more symbolic than practical protection. Water was scarce and precious, hauled up from the river below. In summer, temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees, baking the ground and testing the endurance of men accustomed to more temperate climates. Soldiers' journals from this period frequently mention the psychological toll of the environment, the relentless sun, the isolation, and the constant awareness of being surrounded by lands and peoples they did not understand. Lieutenant James Parker described the atmosphere at Fort Yuma in his private correspondence. The men speak of "out there" with a mixture of fear and fascination, as if beyond our walls lies not merely physical danger, but some form of moral contagion. They tell stories of white men who have gone native, abandoning civilization for life among the tribes, and these tales are whispered like ghost stories, warnings of a fate worse than death. It is into this atmosphere of superstition and dread that Miss Oatman has returned, carrying with her the visible evidence of having crossed the boundary our presence here is meant to maintain. It was into this atmosphere of tension that Olive Oatman returned, carrying with her something that the residents of Fort Yuma found profoundly disturbing, an ease with the very wilderness they feared. According to the account of Amelia Stanwood, wife of one of the officers, Olive moved differently than other women, her steps silent and measured, her awareness of her surroundings unnervingly acute. In her journal, Stanwood confessed, "I find myself watching her when she believes herself unobserved. There is something in her manner that suggests she knows things about this harsh land that we do not, things perhaps we should not know." Stanwood's journal contains detailed observations of Olive's daily habits, noting behaviors that seemed innocuous, but collectively created an impression of profound difference. She rises before dawn without fail, standing at her window facing east as the sun appears. She drinks water in a specific pattern, small sips at regular intervals, rather than natural drinking. When birds call, particularly the desert ravens, she tilts her head in a listening posture that I have observed in local Indians, but never in white women. Most disturbing is her relationship to shadows. She will sometimes stop mid-motion when a shadow crosses her path, not in fear, but in what appears to be acknowledgement. Other residents of Fort Yuma reported similar observations. Captain Edward Stanwood noted in his official report that Olive demonstrates unusual adaptability to the environment, showing none of the distress common to ladies in this harsh climate. What he omitted from his official correspondence, but mentioned in letters to colleagues in California, was more revealing. The Oatman woman knows things about this territory that my scouts do not, the location of water sources unmarked on any map, weather patterns that my most experienced men cannot predict, paths through seemingly impassable terrain. When asked how she acquired this knowledge, she only says, "The desert teaches those who listen." What follows is not merely the story of a captive's return, but an examination of what happens when the boundary between captive and free, between civilized and wild, becomes irrevocably blurred. It is a chronicle of a woman who returned from the wilderness with her skin marked by tattoos and her mind marked by experiences that defied the comfortable narratives of her time. And it is the story of a community confronted with a truth they could neither fully comprehend nor entirely suppress, that perhaps what waited beyond their walls was not what they had been led to believe. The military records regarding Olive Oatman's return to Fort Yuma state that she was given a private room in the officers' quarters, provided with appropriate clothing, and assigned a female companion to help her readjust to civilized life. What these records fail to mention, but what emerges from private correspondence, is the profound unease her presence created, not because of her appearance or her history, but because of what she represented, the possibility of having witnessed another way of living and perhaps most disturbingly, of having found value in it. The room assigned to Olive was small but comfortable by fort standards, a bed with clean linens, a washstand, a chair and small desk, and a window overlooking the desert to the west. Captain Stanwood noted in his report that the room was appropriately furnished for a lady of Miss Oatman's standing, but Amelia Stanwood's journal reveals that the space was modified in response to Olive's behavior. The looking-glass was removed after Miss Oatman covered it with a cloth, claiming that reflections carry messages. The rug was taken away at her request, as she preferred to feel the bare floor beneath her feet. The crucifix that Mrs. Palmer placed on the wall was found each morning turned to face the eastern window, though Miss Oatman denies touching it. According to Sarah Palmer, the woman assigned to Olive's care, she stands at the window each night facing west toward the Colorado River and the territories beyond. When I ask if she is looking for something specific, she only says, "They are watching to see if I remember." When pressed about who they might be, Olive reportedly would not elaborate. Palmer's journal details her attempts to reintroduce Olive to the practices and habits of civilized life, efforts that met with a peculiar form of resistance, not outright refusal, but a kind of selective adherence that seemed calculated to maintain appearances while preserving some inner autonomy. Miss Oatman accepts instruction in proper deportment with perfect politeness, but implements these lessons only when in public view, Palmer wrote. In private, she reverts to postures and habits that can only be described as native in character, sitting on the floor rather than chairs, eating with her fingers rather than utensils, and maintaining that unsettling stillness for hours at a time, as if listening to something inaudible to normal ears. Most troubling to Palmer were Olive's sleeping habits. She refuses to sleep in the bed provided, instead arranging blankets on the floor in a circular pattern and resting in the center. When I insisted this was inappropriate for a Christian woman, she looked at me with those unnervingly direct eyes and said, "Sleep is when the boundaries thin, Mrs. Palmer. One must be prepared for visitations." When I asked what she meant by visitations, she smiled in a way that made me distinctly uncomfortable and said, "Those who watch from the other side." The official narrative that would eventually be constructed around Olive Oatman emphasized her role as a victim rescued from savagery. But the documents sealed away in 1963 tell a more complex story, one of a woman caught between worlds, carrying knowledge that disturbed those around her, and harboring secrets that would never fully come to light. This is the true story of the marked woman of Fort Yuma, as assembled from sources long hidden from public view. The morning after Olive's arrival at Fort Yuma, the fort's physician, Dr. Jonathan Letterman, conducted an examination to assess her physical condition. His medical report, filed with Major Heinzelman, contains primarily standard observations about her general health, which he described as surprisingly robust given the circumstances of her captivity. However, the doctor's private notes, discovered among his personal papers after his death, reveal more troubling observations. The subject's physical health belies the expected condition of one who has endured such hardship, he wrote. Unlike other rescued captives I have examined, she shows no signs of malnourishment or abuse. More concerning are the markings on her arms, not the facial tattoo, which is clearly of native origin, but the series of small scars on her forearms that appear to be deliberate and patterned. When questioned about these marks, she stated only that some knowledge must be carried in the flesh when words are not trusted. Dr. Letterman's examination notes include detailed observations about Olive's physical condition that diverged significantly from the expected medical presentation of a captivity survivor. Subject's musculature is unusually well developed, particularly in the legs and back, suggesting consistent physical activity of a demanding nature. Her hands bear calluses consistent with regular use of tools for digging, grinding, and crafting. Not the soft hands one would expect of a woman raised in civilization. Her feet show adaptations to barefoot walking on rough terrain with thickened skin and splayed toes that provide more stable balance. Most striking in Letterman's assessment was his observation about Olive's overall physical adaptation to desert life. Miss Oatman demonstrates physiological adaptations to the desert environment that typically require years to develop: efficient water conservation, tolerance for heat, and what appears to be unusually acute sensory awareness. When tested, her ability to detect subtle changes in air pressure, temperature, and ambient sound significantly exceeds that of any white inhabitant of the fort, including scouts with decades of frontier experience. Dr. Letterman also noted Olive's unusual responses to his questions about her dietary habits among the Mohave. She describes consuming foods that no white person could find sustenance in, certain roots, insects, and preparations of desert plants that are known to be toxic. When I expressed surprise at this, she regarded me with what I can only describe as pity, saying, "The poison teaches the body what is true." When the doctor inquired about specific plants that the Mohave consumed, Olive provided detailed information about preparation methods that rendered seemingly toxic substances not merely safe, but nutritious. Miss Oatman described a process for preparing the mesquite bean that involves a sequence of soaking, drying, and grinding that removes bitter compounds while preserving what she called the strength inside. When I suggested that such knowledge might be valuable for soldiers stationed in desert regions, she regarded me with a peculiar expression and said, "Your soldiers would starve with food all around them. They have not been taught to recognize what the land offers freely." The most disturbing passage in Letterman's notes concerns Olive's reaction when he mentioned the possibility of removing or reducing her facial tattoo. At the suggestion that the markings could be diminished through a series of careful procedures, the subject became agitated for the first time during our interaction. She grasped my wrist with unexpected strength and said, "They are not on my skin, doctor. They are under it. They were always there, waiting to be revealed." I found myself unable to maintain eye contact with her after this statement, though I cannot articulate precisely why this was so. Dr. Letterman's notes also record his observations about Olive's sleep patterns, which he monitored at Major Heinzelman's request after reports of her nighttime activities. Subject appears to enter a sleep state unlike any I have previously observed, a condition of physical rest combined with what appears to be acute awareness. When questioned about this phenomenon, she stated that the Mohave teach sleep as a skill, not merely an absence of wakefulness. She claimed that in this state she could travel beyond the body while maintaining awareness of her physical surroundings. Letterman concluded his private assessment with an observation he felt unable to include in his official report. "I have treated soldiers who returned from extended campaigns, women who survived violent attacks, and children who witnessed terrible events. Her breathing and heart rate slow to levels comparable to deep sleep, yet she responds immediately to any approach, opening her eyes without the disorientation, typical of someone awakened suddenly." In each case, I could identify the nature of their psychological wounds. With Miss Oatman, I cannot shake the unsettling impression that what I am observing is not trauma, but transformation, not a woman damaged by her experiences, but one who has been altered by them in ways I lack the framework to comprehend. After her initial examination and a period of adjustment, Olive was introduced to the wider Fort Yuma community during a Sunday service held in the fort's modest chapel. Accounts of this event come primarily from the journal of Reverend Thomas Williams, the fort's chaplain, who had been specifically instructed by Major Heinzelman to help reintegrate Olive into Christian practice. The chapel at Fort Yuma was a simple adobe structure with wooden benches, a small altar, and a cross mounted on the wall behind it. Windows cut high in the walls allowed light to enter while preventing distraction, creating a space that felt removed from the harsh desert outside. On the Sunday following Olive's arrival, the room was unusually full, not from religious fervor, but from curiosity about the returned captive. Reverend Williams described the atmosphere that morning as charged with an unspoken tension, all eyes covertly observing Miss Oatman while pretending not to do so. He noted that Olive was seated in the front row, accompanied by Sarah Palmer and Amelia Stanwood, both ladies maintaining a protective proximity that seemed motivated more by containment than comfort. Miss Oatman sat perfectly still throughout the service, Williams wrote, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. The congregation consisted primarily of soldiers, but also included the few officers' wives stationed at the fort, civilian contractors, and some local traders who made a point of attending services when visiting. When the congregation sang hymns, she watched their moving mouths with an intensity that several parishioners later described as unsettling. She did not join in the singing, nor did she bow her head during prayers. When I administered communion, she accepted the bread but held it in her palm, studying it rather than consuming it. Williams's journal records that his sermon that day focused on the story of the prodigal son, a choice he later acknowledged was pointed, intended to emphasize themes of return and reintegration. I spoke of the joy of homecoming, the embrace of the Father, and the restoration of the lost to their rightful place, he wrote. Throughout this address, Miss Oatman's expression remained unchanged, except for a single moment when I described the fatted calf being killed for the feast. At this, a brief smile crossed her features, not one of pleasure, but what I can only describe as ironic recognition, as if she perceived a meaning in the text entirely different from what I intended to convey. After the service, Reverend Williams attempted to speak privately with Olive about her spiritual experiences during captivity. Instead, she looked at me with those unnervingly steady eyes and asked, "Which direction do you face when you pray, Reverend?" When I explained that orientation was not significant in Christian practice, she nodded as if I had confirmed something she suspected and said, "That explains much about your God." Williams recorded his attempts to guide the conversation toward conventional religious themes, asking Olive if she had found comfort in remembering scripture or prayers during her captivity. His journal entry from that day reveals his discomfort with their conversation. I inquired whether she had been able to maintain her faith during her ordeal, expecting either confirmation or a confession of spiritual struggle. Her response was not what he anticipated. Miss Oatman considered the question carefully before replying, "I found that words memorized in one world lose their power in another. The Mohave taught me different words, shaped for the world as it actually exists, rather than as you imagine it to be." The Reverend noted that he tried to interpret this statement charitably, suggesting that Olive had found ways to translate Christian concepts into terms she could maintain in her difficult circumstances. At this, she regarded me with what appeared to be genuine compassion, and said, "You believe there is only one way to know the world, Reverend, but I have lived in another way, and it did not destroy me as you fear. It revealed things your way conceals." Williams recorded that he attempted to guide the conversation toward Olive's deliverance and return to civilization, suggesting that divine providence had saved her from the savagery of her captors. At this, he noted, for the first time, a genuine emotion crossed her features, not gratitude or relief, as one might expect, but something akin to amusement. "Savagery is not what you think it is," she said. "Neither is deliverance." The Reverend concluded his entry with a troubling observation. "I had expected to find a soul in need of spiritual comfort, a lost lamb grateful to return to the fold. Instead, I encountered something I have struggled to name. It was as if I were speaking not to someone who had been isolated from God's Word, but to someone who had heard a different word entirely, one that had taken root so deeply that mine seemed, in comparison, insubstantial. I shall continue to work with Miss Oatman, but I confess I approach this task now with a disquiet I had not anticipated." In subsequent entries, Williams documented his attempts to reintegrate Olive into Christian practice through regular Bible readings and prayer sessions. These efforts met with what he described as polite accommodation that never deepens into genuine engagement. He noted that Olive would listen attentively to scripture readings but often responded with questions that he found disquieting. "When I read the passage from Genesis about dominion over the earth and its creatures," she asked, "how can one have dominion over what one depends upon for life? Does the child have dominion over the mother?" Most troubling to Williams was Olive's response when he asked if she had been forced to participate in pagan rituals during her captivity. She was silent for a long moment before responding, "They did not speak of their ceremonies as worship, but as conversation, an exchange with forces that sustain life. They no more forced this upon me than you force a child to breathe. It was simply the way of existing in that world." When I suggested that such practices were contrary to Christian teaching, she regarded me with that unsettling directness and said, "Perhaps that is why your people fear the wilderness so deeply. You have declared it empty of divinity, and so you experience it as empty of meaning." In the weeks following her return, efforts were made to restore Olive to what was considered proper feminine behavior and appearance. Sarah Palmer, the officer's wife assigned to Olive's care, kept detailed notes about this process, apparently as material for a book she hoped to write about the redemption of captive women. These notes, never published but preserved among her personal effects, provide insight into the private interactions with Olive that contrasted sharply with the public narrative being constructed. Palmer's background made her particularly suited to the task of rehabilitating Olive, or so she believed. The daughter of a New England minister, educated at a women's seminary in Boston, and married to an officer whose career had taken them to various frontier postings, Sarah Palmer considered herself an emissary of civilization in savage lands. Her journals reveal a woman committed to maintaining rigorous standards of propriety and Christian morality, despite the challenges of frontier life. She approached the task of Olive's reintegration with missionary zeal, viewing it as an opportunity to demonstrate the resilience of civilization against the corrupting influence of savage life. "Today, I showed Miss Oatman how to properly arrange her hair in the current fashion," Palmer wrote in late April 1856. "She submitted to my ministrations without resistance, but watched my hands in the mirror with an expression I found difficult to interpret. When I had finished, she ran her fingers through the carefully arranged curls, destroying an hour's work in seconds. Hair should feel the wind," she said, "not be imprisoned against the skull." Palmer documented her attempts to reintroduce Olive to the concepts of privacy and modesty that governed women's behavior in Victorian society. "I have had to explain that one does not disrobe in the presence of others, even other women," she wrote. Miss Oatman received this instruction with what appeared to be genuine confusion, asking why the natural state of the body should be considered inappropriate for view. When I explained the Christian principles of modesty, she considered this thoughtfully before replying, "Your shame about the body seems to give it more power over your thoughts, not less." Palmer documented numerous similar incidents: Olive's reluctance to wear shoes indoors, Her habit of rising before dawn to watch the sun rise from the highest accessible point in the fort, her tendency to handle food with her fingers rather than utensils. It is as if she is performing civilization rather than resuming it, Palmer observed. She observes our customs with the detached interest of an anthropologist among foreign peoples. Particularly challenging to Palmer were Olive's attitudes toward physical comfort and convenience. Miss Oatman seems genuinely perplexed by our constant pursuit of ease, she wrote. When I explained the purpose of the new rocking chair acquired for her room, that it provides comfort during leisure hours, she asked why one would wish to move while remaining in the same place. Movement should take you somewhere, she said, not merely create the illusion of journey while keeping you contained. Most revealing are Palmer's notes about Olive's reaction to the corset and multiple layers of clothing considered essential for proper ladies. Among the Mohave, binding is only done to bodies after death, to prepare them for burning. She did eventually allow me to help her into the garment, but later told me that she removes it immediately upon returning to her private room, claiming that restricted breath leads to restricted thoughts. Palmer's frustration is evident in her description of Olive's response to the multiple petticoats required for proper feminine silhouette. When I explained that a lady must wear at least 3 petticoats for modesty and proper appearance, Miss Oatman listened politely before asking, "How does one run in such a cage?" Miss Oatman examined the corset as if it were an instrument of torture, running her fingers along the whalebone stays. "You bind your ribs to reshape your breathing," she said, not as a question, but as an observation. "How does one climb or swim or move with purpose?" When I replied that ladies have little need for such vigorous activities, she regarded me with what I can only describe as pity, and said, "Then your women live as if already half dead." By May, Palmer's notes show increasing frustration with her charge's resistance to reacculturation. I explained to Miss Oatman that her prospects for reintegration into society, perhaps even marriage, would depend on her ability to conform to expectations of ladylike behavior. She listened politely, then asked a question that has troubled me since. "Why do you believe I wish to be reintegrated?" When I reminded her of the blessings of civilization and Christian community, she looked at me with what I can only describe as compassion and said, "There are different kinds of captivity, Mrs. Palmer. Some have walls you can see." Palmer's journal reveals her growing uncertainty about the task she had undertaken with such confidence. "I begin to question whether what we are attempting is truly restoration or something more akin to erasure," she wrote in late May. There are moments when Miss Oatman demonstrates perfect understanding of our customs and expectations, performing them with flawless precision, only to then make some observation that reveals she sees our way of life not as natural or superior, but as merely one possibility among many, and perhaps not the most meaningful one. Most disturbing to Palmer was the growing sense that Olive's apparent compliance masked a deeper, more profound resistance. "She accepts instruction and correction with perfect politeness," Palmer noted, "but I cannot shake the impression that she is merely humoring us, preserving some inner core of experience that our efforts cannot touch. It is as if she dwells partly in another world to which we have no access, one that she has not left behind as we assumed, but carries within her like a secret landscape folded inside the visible one." In early June 1856, an incident occurred that was documented in multiple sources, but treated differently in each account. According to the official report filed by Major Heinzelman, Olive was discovered missing from her quarters before dawn. After a brief search, she was found at the edge of the fort, near the western wall, apparently attempting to communicate with someone outside the perimeter. The Major's report indicates that no evidence of outside presence was found, and he attributed the incident to the subject's lingering confusion about her circumstances. This clinical description contrasts sharply with accounts found in private correspondence and journals. The night in question was described by several witnesses as unusual, unseasonably cool for June, with a waning moon partially obscured by high clouds that created shifting patterns of light and shadow across the fort grounds. The sentry who first noted Olive's absence, Private Thomas Mercer, recorded in a letter to his family that he had been unusually alert that night due to a persistent sensation of being watched from beyond the walls, though no sign of hostiles was visible. However, the journal of Lieutenant James Parker, who led the search party, offers a different perspective. We found Miss Oatman standing at the western edge of the fort, her hands pressed against the wall. She was speaking rapidly in what I presume was the Mohave language. When we approached, she did not seem startled or guilty, merely turning to acknowledge our presence before continuing her discourse with the empty desert. Most disturbing was her expression, one of perfect clarity and purpose, not the confusion or delirium the Major suggests in his report. Parker's account continues with details omitted from official documentation. The night air was unusually still, yet while Miss Oatman spoke, the torches we carried flickered as if in response to her words. Several men in the search party reported an unusual sensation, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. Private Simmons became so discomfited that he requested permission to return to the barracks, claiming the back of his neck had gone cold despite the desert heat. Parker went on to note that when they escorted Olive back to her quarters, she came willingly but told him, "They are patient. They have always been patient with us." When he asked who they were, she reportedly smiled and said, "Those who were here before there were walls, Lieutenant. Those who will remain when the walls are gone." The lieutenant's journal records his impression that Miss Oatman was neither confused nor disoriented during this incident, but rather engaged in a purposeful activity that our interruption merely postponed rather than prevented. I cannot shake the sense that we witnessed not a breakdown or relapse, but a form of communication beyond our comprehension, like interrupting a conversation in a language none of us is equipped to understand. Sarah Palmer's account of the aftermath adds another layer to the incident. She recorded that when she came to attend to Olive that morning, she found her sitting calmly by the window, a small collection of objects arranged on the sill before her. A feather, a smooth river stone, what appeared to be a fragment of bone, and a small pouch of reddish powder. When Palmer asked about these items, Olive allegedly replied, "Messages need vessels. Words are not always enough." Palmer wrote that she reported these objects to Major Heinzelman, who ordered them removed and destroyed as savage tokens. She noted, "After the items were taken away, Miss Oatman did not protest or appear distressed. She simply nodded as if confirming something she had expected and said, 'What is carried inside cannot be taken.'" Private Mercer, who was assigned to dispose of the items, later wrote to his sister that he had been unable to complete this task as ordered. "The Major instructed me to burn the Indian woman's trinkets, but when I attempted to do so, the flame would not catch them despite multiple attempts with dry kindling and good tinder. Eventually, I buried them at the base of the west wall, marking the spot with a small stone. I have told no one of this failure, fearing it would be attributed to superstition on my part, but I swear on our Mother's Bible that fire would not touch these objects no matter how I tried to apply it." This incident marked a turning point in the official handling of Olive Oatman at Fort Yuma. Subsequent reports show increased restrictions on her movements and more aggressive efforts to reintegrate her into white society, including daily religious instruction and the constant companionship of female chaperones. These measures were publicly presented as protective and rehabilitative, but private correspondence suggests they were motivated, at least in part, by unease about Olive's influence and concerns about what exactly had transpired during her time with the Mohave. As news of Olive Oatman's return spread beyond Fort Yuma, public interest in her story grew rapidly. By July 1856, several newspaper reporters had made the difficult journey to the remote outpost, eager to publish accounts of her captivity. These interviews were carefully managed by Major Heinzelman, who assigned officers to monitor all conversations and established guidelines for what topics could be discussed. The journalists who arrived at Fort Yuma encountered a young woman who presented a carefully composed public image, modest, soft-spoken, and appropriately grateful for her rescue and return to civilization. She appeared at these interviews dressed in the current fashion, her hair properly arranged, the blue tattoo on her chin the only visible evidence of her time among the Mohave. This controlled presentation reinforced the narrative that military authorities wished to promote, that Olive had endured captivity while maintaining her essential civilization and virtue, and now sought only to resume her proper place in white society. Despite these precautions, some of Olive's responses to journalists' questions created discomfort. The Arizona Territorial Star published an article on July 28, 1856, that mostly adhered to the expected narrative of suffering and rescue, but included one exchange that the editor felt compelled to include despite its unsettling nature. When asked about the most difficult aspect of her captivity, Miss Oatman was silent for several moments before responding, learning that everything I had been taught about the world was incomplete. Pressed to explain this curious statement, she said, "There are patterns beneath the surface of things that most people never perceive. They do not fear them as white people do." Miss Oatman then declined to elaborate further on this point. The reporter, a man named Ellis Hammond, later wrote to a colleague in San Francisco about portions of the interview that his editor had refused to publish. Miss Oatman spoke of Mohave beliefs and practices with a respect that bordered on reverence, describing their relationship to the natural world not as primitive superstition, but as sophisticated knowledge acquired through generations of observation. The Mohave understand these patterns. Most disturbing was her assertion that the Mohave do not merely survive in the desert, they converse with it. They understand its language in a way that your civilization has forgotten. When I suggested that science provided more reliable knowledge than savage intuition, she smiled in a way that made me distinctly uneasy, and said, "Science sees only what it has already decided to look for." The San Francisco Chronicle sent journalist William Sherwood to interview Olive in August. His published piece followed the conventional captivity narrative, but his private notes, discovered among his papers after his death in 1887, reveal portions of the interview that he chose not to include. I inquired about the facial tattoo, asking if it had been forced upon her. Miss Oatman's response was unexpected. The marks were a gift, she said, a way of being seen correctly. When I suggested that such markings would forever identify her as someone who had lived among savages, she smiled in a way that made me distinctly uncomfortable, and said, "That is precisely the point, Mr. Sherwood. Some truths should be written where they cannot be hidden." Sherwood's notes describe his attempt to elicit details about Mohave religious practices, a subject of lurid fascination for his readership. When I inquired about pagan ceremonies or sacrifices, expecting tales of barbaric rituals, Miss Oatman regarded me with surprising compassion. "You seek confirmation of what you already believe about people you have decided to fear," she said. "The Mohave would find your curiosity about their ceremonies as strange as you would find someone demanding details about your bedroom habits or bowel movements. Some knowledge is not meant for entertainment." Sherwood also noted Olive's peculiar reaction when he asked about her rescue. Miss Oatman corrected me immediately, stating, "It was not a rescue, but a return." There is a difference. When I inquired about whether she had attempted to escape during her captivity, she looked at me with what I can only describe as pity and said, "Escape suggests somewhere else to go. I was already there." The journalist concluded his private notes with an observation he felt unable to include in his published account. "In my 15 years of interviewing subjects who have experienced extraordinary circumstances, I have encountered reactions of trauma, resilience, anger, and gratitude. What I observed in Miss Oatman was something altogether different, a quality I struggle to name, but that left me with the unsettling impression that she was not, as I had assumed, a white woman temporarily displaced into savage life, but something transformed beyond the categories by which we organize our understanding of humanity." Other journalists who interviewed Olive during this period reported similar impressions. James Wilson of the California Courier wrote to his editor, "There is something in Miss Oatman's manner that defies simple categorization as either traumatized victim or resilient survivor. She responds to questions with perfect composure, yet often in ways that subtly undermine the premises of our inquiry." When asked about the hardships of living among savages, she redirected the conversation to describe desert plants and their uses, cloud patterns that predict rain, and methods of finding water in apparently dry landscapes. Practical knowledge delivered with an appreciation that seemed to challenge our assumption that her experience had been one of deprivation rather than education. These journalistic accounts, both published and private, reveal the difficulty of fitting Olive Oatman's experience into the established narrative framework of Indian captivity stories. While the published articles largely conform to public expectations, emphasizing suffering, endurance, and eventual rescue, the private notes and correspondence of those who interviewed her suggest an encounter with someone whose experience had fundamentally altered her relationship to the categories and assumptions that structured 19th century American society. By September 1856, arrangements were being made for Olive's departure from Fort Yuma. Her surviving brother Lorenzo, who had been searching for his sisters since recovering from injuries sustained in the initial attack, had been notified of her return and was journeying to California to reunite with her. Plans were developed to transport Olive to San Francisco, where her story could be more widely disseminated and where she might, with proper guidance, be reintegrated into society. The impending departure created a sense of urgency among those at Fort Yuma who had become invested in understanding Olive's transformation. Dr. Letterman conducted a final medical examination, noting in his private records, "As Miss Oatman prepares to leave our care, I find myself troubled by how little we have truly comprehended about her experience. We have documented her physical condition, monitored her behavior, and recorded her statements. Yet I cannot escape the sense that we have merely cataloged the surface of something far more profound, like naturalists who believe they understand the ocean by collecting specimens washed up on shore." As her departure approached, several incidents occurred that were documented in various sources, but minimized in official records. Lieutenant Parker's journal describes finding Olive on the fort's roof one night in mid-September. She was arranged in a peculiar posture, kneeling with her arms extended toward the mountains to the north. Around her on the rooftop were small arrangements of stones and patterns I did not recognize. When I asked what she was doing, she said simply, "Remembering my promises." She offered no resistance when I escorted her back to her quarters, but whispered something in Mohave as we descended the stairs. Though I do not speak the language, the sound of those words has remained with me, carrying a weight I cannot explain. Private Thomas Mercer, who had developed a habit of watching Olive's movements whenever his duties permitted, recorded in a letter to his sister an incident not mentioned in any official report. 3 days before her scheduled departure, Miss Oatman was permitted a supervised walk along the river below the fort. As we approached the water, a large raven landed on a dead cottonwood nearby. Miss Oatman stopped and appeared to address the bird in the Indian tongue. To my astonishment, the raven remained perfectly still throughout her discourse, its black eyes fixed upon her face. When she finished speaking, the bird gave a single harsh cry and flew directly westward toward the territories where she had been held. I mentioned this incident to Lieutenant Parker, who advised me not to include it in any official report lest it be attributed to superstition or imagination on my part. Dr. Letterman noted in his private records a strange request from Olive during her final physical examination before departure. Miss Oatman asked if I would examine her throat, claiming she could feel something lodged there that had been present since her return to the fort. I found no physical abnormality, but was struck by her insistence that words are stuck inside, unable to emerge. When I suggested this might be an emotional rather than physical sensation, she regarded me with that disconcerting directness and said, "The body knows truths the mind refuses. That is why the Mohave mark the skin, to make the hidden visible. The doctor also recorded an unexpected question from Olive during this final examination. She inquired whether I had ever observed patterns in my own dreams that corresponded to events in waking life. When I acknowledged occasional coincidences of this nature, she nodded as if confirming a hypothesis and said, "The Mohave cultivate this correspondence deliberately. They understand that dreams are not merely reflections of the day's events, but pathways to knowledge not accessible during waking hours. They taught me to recognize these patterns and to use them as guides." When I suggested that such beliefs represented primitive superstition rather than reliable knowledge, she smiled with that unsettling composure and said, "You dismiss as superstition what you lack the framework to understand. The Mohave would find your certainty about the boundaries of reality equally primitive." Perhaps most significantly, Sarah Palmer recorded a conversation with Olive the night before her scheduled departure. According to Palmer's notes, Olive seemed unusually animated, speaking more freely than at any time since her arrival. She told me that the Mohave believe dreams are as real as waking life, that the boundary between the two is artificial and dangerous. "They taught me to walk in dreams while my body slept," she said, "to visit places far from where my flesh rested. That is how I will return to them after I leave this place, not in body, but in the other self that travels while the eyes are closed." Palmer wrote that she attempted to dismiss these ideas as savage superstitions that Olive would soon overcome once properly reestablished in civilization. In response, Olive allegedly took Palmer's hand and placed it against the tattoo on her chin. "Feel how the skin is different here," she said. "The marks go deeper than you can touch. They connect me to what cannot be severed by distance or time. You believe I am leaving tomorrow, but part of me has never left the Mohave lands, and part of them comes with me, wherever I go." Most disturbing to Palmer was Olive's final statement during this conversation. "The Mohave have a saying, 'What is most real is what cannot be seen with the eyes.' They understand that the visible world is merely the surface of something far more vast and complex. Your people build walls to separate inside from outside, civilized from savage, known from unknown. But these boundaries exist only in your minds. They taught me to see beyond such artificial divisions, to recognize that all is connected in patterns your language has no words to describe. That knowledge can never be taken from me, no matter how many layers of your civilization are placed upon me." The final entry in Palmer's notes about Olive, dated September 29, 1856, reads simply, "Miss Oatman departed Fort Yuma this morning, accompanied by military escort to San Bernardino." I find myself troubled by our final conversation, and by the strange sense that, despite all our efforts, we never truly brought her back from the wilderness. Perhaps some boundaries once crossed allow no return journey. The journey from Fort Yuma to San Bernardino, where Olive would meet her brother Lorenzo, took approximately 2 weeks. The military escort was led by Lieutenant Howard Banks, who kept a detailed journal of the expedition. His entries provide insight into Olive's behavior during this transition period, away from the confines of the fort but not yet reintegrated into mainstream society. The route from Fort Yuma to San Bernardino traversed some of the most challenging terrain in the American Southwest, first following the Colorado River northward, then crossing the Mohave Desert before ascending through mountain passes to reach the relative greenery of the San Bernardino Valley. The journey involved long days of travel through intense heat, camping at water sources that were often barely sufficient for the party's needs, and constant vigilance against potential hostilities from native groups whose territories they crossed. Lieutenant Banks assembled a small but well-equipped escort, himself, 2 other soldiers, a guide familiar with the territory, and a female companion for Olive, a Mrs. Eleanor Tompkins, wife of one of the fort's contractors. The party traveled with 4 mules carrying supplies and 2 horses for alternating riders, as most of the journey would be made on foot. Banks's journal indicates that the expedition was furnished with provisions sufficient for 3 weeks' travel, weapons appropriate to our number, and medicines as recommended by Dr. Letterman. Miss Oatman maintains a composed demeanor during daylight hours, Banks wrote on October 3rd, but her behavior changes noticeably after sunset. She refuses to sleep inside the tent provided for her, preferring to rest in the open air, regardless of temperature. When asked about this preference, she stated that walls prevent necessary visitations during sleep. Banks noted Olive's peculiar habits of food consumption. She accepts the rations provided, but supplements them with plants gathered during our daily travels. Despite my warnings about potential toxicity, she consumes these with confidence, identifying each by a Mohave name and explaining its purpose. This one for strength, that one for clear vision, another for remembering correctly. When our cook expressed concern about her eating certain berries known to be purgative, she smiled and said, "Your body rejects what it has not been taught to recognize as food." The lieutenant observed that as they traveled further from Fort Yuma, Olive's demeanor subtly changed. She moves with increasing confidence and purpose, often ranging ahead of our party to examine tracks or plants with an expertise that even our guide acknowledges as impressive. Her posture has altered, the careful, contained movements cultivated by Mrs. Palmer giving way to a more fluid and natural carriage. Most notable is her relationship to the landscape. She does not merely travel through it, but engages with it, touching rocks and trees, pausing to listen to bird calls, examining the soil with a tactile intimacy that suggests deep familiarity. Most troubling to the lieutenant were Olive's nighttime activities. On the third night, I awoke to find her sitting several yards from camp, scraping at the earth with a stick. As I approached, I observed that she had drawn an elaborate pattern in the dirt, concentric circles bisected by wavy lines. When I asked what she was doing, she replied without looking up, "Making a map." When I inquired as to what the map depicted, she said, "The way between." She would not elaborate further. Banks's journal entries reveal his growing unease as the journey progressed. Miss Oatman speaks less with each passing day, but her silence does not seem born of reticence or fear. Rather, it is as if words have become superfluous to her experience of the landscape. She communicates instead through gesture and expression, particularly with our guide, who increasingly defers to her judgment about routes and water sources. Yesterday she led us to a spring that did not appear on any of our maps, a small seep hidden beneath an overhanging rock that our guide confessed he would never have found without her direction. On October 9th, the party encountered a small group of Quechan Indians, traditional enemies of the Mohave. Banks described the unexpected interaction. To my astonishment, Miss Oatman addressed the Indians in what appeared to be their own language. A brief conversation ensued, during which she maintained perfect composure while the Indians exhibited visible unease. When they departed, I asked what had been said. She informed me that she had asked if they had seen the signs in the water recently, and they had confirmed they had. When I pressed for an explanation, she said only, "Some conversations are not for translation, Lieutenant." The most disturbing incident during the journey occurred on October 11th, as the party made camp near a dry riverbed in the heart of the Mohave Desert. Banks's account of this night contains a level of detail unusual for his typically matter-of-fact reporting style. The sky was unusually clear, with stars visible to the horizon in all directions. Miss Oatman requested permission to walk a short distance from camp, which I granted on condition that she remain within sight. She positioned herself on a slight rise approximately 50 yards from our fire and remained standing motionless for nearly an hour, facing west toward territories invisible in the darkness. Banks continued. Around midnight, I was awakened by Mrs. Tompkins, who reported that Miss Oatman was speaking in her sleep in what sounded like the Mohave language. Upon checking her bedroll, we discovered it empty. A search revealed her standing in the same position as earlier, still facing west. As we approached, we became aware of an unusual silence. The typical night sounds of the desert had ceased entirely. Miss Oatman appeared to be speaking, though no audible words emerged from her moving lips. Most disturbing was the quality of the air around her, which seemed to shimmer slightly, as if heated, though the night was cool. The lieutenant reported that when they attempted to approach Olive, they experienced an inexplicable resistance, as if the air itself had thickened. When they finally reached her and spoke her name, she turned to acknowledge us with perfect composure, showing no surprise at our presence or awareness of anything unusual in her behavior. "The distance is closing," she said. "Soon it will not matter where my body stands." When asked to explain this statement, she merely smiled and allowed herself to be led back to camp, though both Mrs. Tompkins and I noted that her skin was unnaturally warm to the touch despite the cool night air. Upon reaching San Bernardino on October 14, 1856, Olive was reunited with her brother Lorenzo, who had last seen her 5 years earlier, before the attack that separated them. Multiple witnesses documented this reunion, but with notably different emphasis. The San Bernardino Guardian published an account describing a tearful, joyous reconnection between the siblings, focusing on Lorenzo's tireless search and Olive's gratitude at being restored to her remaining family. Lorenzo Oatman, 20 years old at the time of the reunion, had spent the years since the attack recovering from his own injuries and searching for his sisters. After being found near death and nursed back to health by another party of travelers, he had made his way to California, where he worked at various jobs while continually seeking information about Olive and Mary Ann. When news reached him of Olive's return, he had immediately arranged to meet her in San Bernardino, traveling from the mining camp where he was then employed. The public account of their reunion emphasized the emotional restoration of family bonds, presenting it as the culmination of a narrative of loss and recovery that reinforced social values about the importance of family and civilization. However, Lieutenant Banks's private record presents a more nuanced observation. The meeting between Miss Oatman and her brother was marked by restraint that I found surprising given the circumstances. While Mr. Oatman wept openly, his sister maintained the composed demeanor I have observed throughout our journey. When he embraced her, she received the gesture passively rather than returning it with equal emotion. Most notable was her response when he declared that his search was finally over. She studied his face carefully and said, "But some things cannot be found again once they have been lost. Can they, Lorenzo?" The young man appeared unsettled by this statement. Banks noted that Lorenzo seemed unprepared for the physical changes in his sister, particularly the facial tattoo. "Mister?" When he finally mentioned them, asking if they had been painful, Miss Oatman touched the blue lines with a gesture that appeared almost affectionate and said they were a necessary pain, like all transformations. This response seemed to increase rather than alleviate her brother's distress. A letter from Mary Wilson, a local woman who hosted the siblings during their first days in San Bernardino, offers additional perspective. The brother speaks constantly of restoring his sister to their former life, making plans for their future, and reminiscing about their childhood. Oatman made a visible effort not to react to the markings on his sister's chin, though his discomfort was apparent. Miss Oatman listens to these recollections with a curious detachment, as if he were describing events that happened to someone else. Yesterday, when Lorenzo mentioned their parents' hopes and plans before the journey west, she interrupted him to say, "Those people in your stories died a long time ago, brother. Even the ones who still walk." The poor young man fell silent after this, and a heaviness hung in the room that none of us knew how to dispel. Wilson observed that the siblings' attempts to reconnect were complicated by fundamentally different interpretations of what had occurred during their separation. Lorenzo speaks of his sister's experience as a tragedy from which she has been rescued, while she seems to regard it as a journey that has altered her in ways he cannot comprehend. When he talks of healing and recovery, she listens with a patience that borders on indulgence, as one might listen to a child's simplistic understanding of complex matters. I fear that what he seeks, the restoration of the sister he lost, is not possible, for that person no longer exists in the woman who has returned. Perhaps most revealing was Wilson's account of a conversation she overheard between the siblings on their third evening in her home. Lorenzo was showing Olive a family Bible that he had preserved, pointing to their names recorded in the family register. Olive traced the names with her finger, pausing at Mary Ann's, and said, "The Mohave believe that names are not merely labels, but connections, that to speak a name is to call to its owner across whatever distance separates you." Lorenzo replied that he had often called to his sisters in his prayers during their absence. Olive looked at him with an expression I found difficult to interpret and said, "But you called to the girls who left with your family years ago." "Those girls no longer exist. I heard your calling, brother, but the person who could answer in the way you wanted was already gone." In the months that followed, Olive Oatman's story became widely known through newspaper accounts, public lectures, and eventually a book, Life Among the Indians, published in 1857. These public narratives established her as a captivity heroine, a white Christian woman who had endured the hardships of savage life while maintaining her essential civilization and virtue, ultimately being rescued and returned to her proper place in society. Royal B. Stratton, a Methodist minister who met Olive in late 1856, took it upon himself to document her story, conducting extensive interviews with both her and Lorenzo. His book, published the following year, presented a narrative that conformed to public expectations, emphasizing the brutality of the initial attack, the suffering of captivity, and the constancy of Christian faith throughout the ordeal. The blue tattoo on Olive's chin was portrayed as a mark of humiliation forced upon her, rather than the voluntary cultural initiation she had described to others in private. Stratton's book became an immediate commercial success, and Olive herself participated in a lecture tour to promote it, appearing on stages throughout California and later in New York, dressed in proper Victorian attire that contrasted dramatically with the tribal markings on her face. These public appearances reinforced the narrative of restoration and reintegration, presenting Olive as a living testament to the resilience of civilization against the corrupting influence of savagery. But private correspondence and unpublished accounts tell a different story about Olive's adjustment to her restored life. Lorenzo Oatman wrote to Lieutenant Banks in December 1856, expressing concern about his sister's behavior. While Olive presents an appropriate face in public appearances, in private she remains disturbingly changed from the sister I remember. She rises before dawn each day to stand facing east, murmuring in the Indian tongue. She has created small collections of objects, stones, feathers, bones, which she arranges in patterns and speaks to as if they could hear. When I removed these items, believing them to be unhealthy reminders of her captivity, she did not protest, but simply created new collections, saying, "The vessels may change, but the message remains." Lorenzo's letter continued with more troubling observations. Most concerning is her relationship to her own reflection. She avoids mirrors generally, but sometimes I find her studying her tattooed face in reflective surfaces, tracing the lines with her fingers and smiling in a way that chills me. When I suggested that doctors in San Francisco might be able to reduce the visibility of these marks, she looked at me with something like pity and said, "The purpose of the marks is to be seen, brother. Why would I unmake what was made to last beyond death?" The letter concluded with an admission of Lorenzo's growing uncertainty. "I sought my sister for 5 years, never abandoning hope that she might be found and restored to the life that was taken from her. Now I question whether that restoration is possible, or indeed whether what I perceive as restoration she experiences as a different form of captivity. There are moments when I glimpse in her eyes a knowledge or awareness that I cannot access, and I am left with the unsettling sense that the sister I recovered is a stranger wearing familiar features, inhabited by experiences I cannot comprehend and, perhaps, should not attempt to erase." By early 1857, as the public narrative of Olive Oatman's captivity and rescue was being solidified through Royal Stratton's book, Her private reality appeared increasingly disconnected from this account. Sarah Palmer, who had maintained correspondence with Olive after her departure from Fort Yuma, received a letter in February that she later described as so disturbing in its content that I burned it after reading, fearing what might happen should it fall into other hands. Palmer recorded in her journal only that the letter contained descriptions of ceremonies Miss Oatman claims to still participate in through some form of visitation during sleep, and assertions about the nature of reality that no Christian woman could accept or repeat. A San Francisco physician, Dr. William Ritter, who examined Olive at Lorenzo's request in early 1857, wrote in his private case notes, "The subject presents a fascinating case of divided consciousness, able to function within society's expectations when necessary, but maintaining what appears to be an entirely separate internal reality." When asked directly about her time among the Indians, she provides responses that align with the published account. However, when conversation turns to more abstract topics, the nature of dreams, the relationship between body and mind, the boundaries of the self, she expresses ideas that deviate radically from Christian and scientific understanding, articulating what can only be described as a native metaphysics with disturbing eloquence and conviction. The last documented encounter with Olive Oatman comes from the journal of Reverend Thomas Williams, who had traveled to San Francisco in March 1857 to attend a religious conference. He recorded visiting Olive at the home where she was staying and finding her much changed in the months since Fort Yuma, more adept at presenting the appearance expected of her, yet somehow more firmly rooted in whatever transformation had occurred during her captivity. Williams wrote of a disturbing exchange during this visit. When we were briefly alone, Miss Oatman grasped my wrist with surprising strength and said, "You believe there is only one world, Reverend, but I have lived in another and still visit it when the sun sleeps. The boundaries you trust are not fixed, but permeable." Before I could respond, she released me and resumed the modest demeanor expected of a young Christian woman, the transition so complete that I might have believed I imagined the previous moment, had the sensation of her fingers not lingered on my skin. The Reverend noted that when conversation turned to her public lectures and the book about her experiences, Olive spoke of these with a detachment that he found unsettling. She referred to the story they have made of me as if discussing a character in a novel rather than her own life. When I suggested that her public testimony might help others understand the dangers of the frontier and the importance of maintaining civilization against savagery, she regarded me with what appeared to be genuine compassion and said, "People believe what they need to believe, Reverend. The story being told about me has little to do with what I experienced, but it serves a purpose for those who tell it and those who hear it. I have learned to inhabit the space they have created for me, just as I learned to inhabit other spaces before." Williams concluded his entry with an observation that perhaps best captures the enduring mystery of Olive Oatman. "We have created a narrative to explain what happened to this young woman, a story of captivity, suffering, and restoration that allows us to maintain our understanding of the boundary between civilization and savagery. But in her eyes, I see knowledge of something that defies this narrative, something that suggests the possibility of moving between worlds in ways our society cannot acknowledge without calling into question the very categories by which we define ourselves. I pray for her soul, but I cannot shake the unsettling sense that she now inhabits a territory of experience for which our prayers were not designed." The public record states that Olive Oatman eventually married, moved east, and lived a quiet life until her death in 1903. The tattoo on her face remained visible throughout her life, a permanent mark of her time among the Mohave. What the public record does not capture are the stories that persisted in private correspondence, unpublished memoirs, and oral traditions, accounts of a woman who lived between worlds, carrying knowledge that disturbed the boundaries Victorian America depended upon. John Fairchild, who married Olive in 1865, wrote in a letter to his brother, "My wife maintains a perfect composure in society, fulfilling all that is expected of a gentleman's wife. Yet there remains something elusive about her inner life, territories of thought and experience to which I am not granted access. She speaks rarely of her time among the Indians, but sometimes I wake in the night to find her standing at the window, her fingers tracing the marks on her chin, whispering words in a language I do not understand. When I ask about these episodes in the morning, she smiles and says only, 'Some conversations must happen in the dark.'" A housekeeper employed by the Fairchilds in the 1870s later recorded in her memoir, "Mrs. Fairchild maintained strange habits that her husband seemed to accept without question. She kept collections of objects, stones, feathers, dried plants, arranged in patterns on windowsills and shelves. She would stand barefoot in the garden at dawn, regardless of weather, her face turned towards the rising sun. Most peculiar were the dreams she sometimes described at breakfast, vivid accounts of walking in desert landscapes, conversing with people she referred to by Mohave names, participating in ceremonies that sounded pagan in nature. When I once suggested that such dreams might be unhealthy memories of her captivity, she regarded me with those strangely direct eyes and said, "They are not memories, but continuations. Some journeys never end." The documents sealed in the Fort Yuma archives until 1963 include a final note from Dr. Jonathan Letterman, written in 1862, long after his service at the fort had ended. In it, he reflected on his encounter with Olive Oatman. "I have treated many patients in the years since examining Miss Oatman, but none has lingered in my thoughts as persistently as she. In medical practice, we believe that to name a condition is to begin to understand it. Yet I have never found a diagnostic category adequate to what I observed in her, not trauma or delusion or any other pathology, but rather a kind of knowledge that our framework of understanding cannot accommodate. She remains, in my mind, not a patient who needed healing, but a message I lacked the language to decipher." Lieutenant Howard Banks, who had escorted Olive from Fort Yuma to San Bernardino, wrote in his journal in 1875, nearly 20 years after their journey, "I still dream of that night in the Mohave Desert when Miss Oatman stood facing west, speaking silently to something unseen, the air around her shimmering with a quality I have never observed before or since. In these dreams, I understand what she was saying, though upon waking the meaning slips away, leaving only a sense of having glimpsed a reality that exists alongside our own, separated by a boundary far more permeable than we choose to believe." Perhaps the most fitting epilogue to this story comes from an unexpected source. A Mohave oral account recorded by an anthropologist in 1903, the year of Olive Oatman's death. In this account, the Mohave spoke not of a white captive who lived among them and was returned to her people, but of a woman named Espaneo, who carried the tribe's marks and moved between worlds. "She walks in two lands, her body in one place and her spirit in another. The blue lines on her chin are the path between these worlds. Even after her flesh was taken back by those who claimed her, she returned to us in dreams, bringing messages from the other side. She continues to walk this path, teaching both peoples about boundaries that appear solid but are not. The true nature of what happened to Olive Oatman, the reality behind the competing narratives of captivity and transformation, remains unknown. What is certain is that her story reveals as much about those who encountered her as it does about her own experience. In the marked woman of Fort Yuma, American society confronted something that could not be fully integrated into its understanding of the world, a presence that suggested boundaries more permeable than fixed, identities more fluid than stable, and knowledge that resided not just in the mind but in the flesh. The tattoo that marked Olive Oatman's face until her death served as a visible reminder of this unsettling possibility, that perhaps what separated civilization from wilderness Christian from savage, known from unknown was not an impermeable barrier but a threshold that could be crossed in both directions, forever altering those who made the journey. In 1963, when the sealed documents were discovered during renovations at the old Fort Yuma site, the historian who first examined them wrote, "These accounts suggest a story far more complex than the traditional captivity narrative that has become part of American folklore. They point to the possibility that the most profound aspect of Olive Oatman's experience was not what was done to her during her time with the Mohave, but what she came to know, knowledge that those who received her back into white society found deeply unsettling, not because it was savage, but because it called into question the very distinction between savage and civilized, upon which their identity depended." The blue lines tattooed on Olive Oatman's chin faded somewhat over the decades of her life but remained visible until her death, 5 vertical marks that, according to Mohave tradition, ensured she would be recognized by tribal ancestors in the afterlife. Whether these marks represented captivity or belonging, trauma or transformation, remains a question that echoes across time. A question about the nature of identity itself, and about what happens when we encounter ways of knowing the world that challenge everything we thought we understood.